It's really a great pleasure to be here. Hopefully I'll be able to give a coherent talk. I just arrived from Canada yesterday, so I'm a bit jet-lagged. But as Cully said, I was actually Buzz Holling's last PhD student. So I think this may be an honor to me or may be a dishonor if I think, I ruined Buzz for other graduate students. They didn't want to work with anyone else after all the problems for me. But it was really a great privilege to work with Buzz. And what I'm going to do now is sort of go backwards a little and not talk about all the things that Buzz has done, but talk about really his contributions to ecological theory. And he's contributed to other things as well. But in some ways, I was looking at all the things that people were talking about, and there's going to be some overlap of what other people are saying. But it felt it was important to sort of give some discussion of the progression of his ideas and what a major contribution he's made to people's ecological thought. And just to sort of summarize this, I sort of lumped things into three main categories. One is predation theory, which Buzz did now almost 50 years ago, and this sort of really came out from his PhD research. But the main papers were published in 1959, to his early work on resilience in 1973, so over about 35 years ago, to then a bit more poorly defined, and I sort of lumped together work on adaptive cycle and panarchy, which I think are very closely connected, with the main or critical contributions being in 1986 in a book chapter in Sustainable Development of the Biosphere, which set the stage for a lot of other stuff. And then the book Panarchy that was already mentioned, that was done with Lance Gunderson, was more a product of the Resilience Alliance. And on the right of this slide, there's three little graphs, and these aren't comprehensive or anything. They're really meant to be indicators. And what this is all showing is the number of citations per year of the predation papers, of the key resilience paper, and of this book chapter in the Panarchy book over time. And they're roughly the same scale, showing from 1960 to the present day and not including this year. But I think what's really, really impressive here is to show that the number of times each of these things is cited, even the one that's from 50 years ago, is still increasing. And I think that's really telling, because it's showing that these ideas that Buzz have had in ecology are major ideas that really any scientist, say like myself, would be happy to have just one of these ideas. And quite famous ecologists often are famous for one idea. And Buzz has had three of them in ecology, and I'm not even going to talk about some of his other contributions to ecological management and theory of ecological economics. Oh, sorry. So these ideas also are sort of connected and had sort of a time sequence to them. It's both from, I think, Buzz's life and as sort of Johan was talking about the major movements of science, of that this early work was coming out about as people were trying to understand things after the Second World War and control and manage nature via sort of modernistic thinking and physics theory. Resilience was coming in sort of the first sort of rise of environmental awareness. And the days of adaptive cycle and panarchy are really coming at the brink of this sort of global or emergent global ecological era. So what were all these things? And for people who are not so into math, you don't need to worry about this too much, but basically what Buzz really contributed to predation theory was actually the first theory to mathematically describe in a general way predation in ecology. So it's a really major thing that people use every day. And often in ecological textbooks, they talk about the Holling disk equation, which when I was first reading, I was trying to figure out how there was a disk involved in this equation. And of course, there isn't a disk, but it's named after early experiments that Buzz used that used disks. So this is sort of showing how valued these things are. And what he did is sort of simplified all the different ways that animals eat one another to say, well, you can really kind of think about, there are three different types of predation. One is where sort of predators just sit around, and as the prey density varies, the amount of predation depends just on how prey density is varying. So this could be like a spider with a web, that as there's more prey, more prey comes into the web. The second type, which is maybe the most common, is where predators have to do something. They have some maybe handling time, or they have to digest the prey. So as prey increases, there's some maximum amount of eating of prey that a predator can do. And you get this line, then as prey density increases, there's some type of saturation. There's a peak amount of predation animals can do. And then the third type, which should be 3 there, is where there's some kind of learning or adjustment of the prey. So this is the idea: when a prey is really rare, animals won't even think about eating it because it's not worthwhile for them to try and figure it out or so. So they have some search image of what's edible, but as it becomes more common, then they switch to it, as they switch from doing one thing to another. And there you get this kind of S-shaped curve. And each of these different types of predation have different consequences for population dynamics. What's shown on this other side here is that you can kind of think of what's the death rate produced by these different types of predation. Thanks. I should have just changed my settings. Yeah. So the point being here is that these different types of prey interacting in the world can tell you about how prey dynamics respond to these different types of predators. So in the first case, the death rate produced by predation is just a straight line. It's just independent. The second one, it declines and saturates. And the third one gives you kind of a more complicated shape where initially it goes up, then it goes down. And so this can generally tell you a lot about how the world works. And the way of thinking about this, I'm missing a line here, is that if you can kind of think about the combination of a birth rate and a death rate, where I should have the straight line up there of the death rate. If you put these two together and thinking about population dynamics, you can think where the birth rate is higher than the death rate, your population increases. Where the death rate is higher than the birth rate, the population will decrease. So if you think about your prey density, if you're below the critical point where the death rate and the birth rate are equal, you move up. If you're above that point, you move down. And this kind of thinking, which is in economics and ecology, it sort of comes from math or physics, is sort of this approach of comparative statics. And as Buzz was talking about, this kind of thinking is in our world, but often our world is a bit more complex of this. There isn't just a simple equilibrium. And his work on predation kind of laid the seeds of this kind of thinking. When he started to look at more complicated real-world problems with, say, looking at budworm epidemics in Canada, where there's an insect that periodically erupts into really high levels that kill trees that people harvest. And so this was a really important kind of practical problem that Buzz started to get involved with because of his expertise in the theoretics of predator-prey systems. And when he looked at this is sort of a more complicated version of the figure I was just showing you, just sort of simplifying things. We're saying, as your population of budworm varies, you can think about, well, what's happening to the change of budworm? Is it the population increasing or decreasing? So the zero line is where it's constant. So those are these equilibrium points. And when Buzz looked at this, he found out that you could have two different equilibrium. You could either have a very low equilibrium of budworm or an epidemic outbreak. And what was kind of controlling your transition between these is bird predation. And that when the forest was young, there was a lot of bird predation. It was really difficult or next to impossible for the forest to move from this sort of low level of infestation to the high level of epidemic. If you're in an epidemic, you could stay in an epidemic. But birds would push you back to this lower equilibrium. But then looking at this, as the forests got older, the amount of bird predation or the effectiveness of the bird predation for controlling budworm decreased. And this is a complicated story, but it's basically in some ways that it's harder for the birds to find the budworm in a more big forest. So the forest dilutes the budworm for the birds, so they can't find them as easily. And in this case, it becomes a bit easier for the forest, for the budworm populations to jump to a higher population. The bird predation doesn't have such a strong force of keeping them back there. So if there's some kind of fluctuation in the climate and the survival of the budworm, or a decline in the bird effectiveness for predation for some reason, you can maybe more easily have an epidemic. And then finally, as the forest gets very old, the birds actually can't control the budworm anymore, and you just jump to an epidemic. So the work that Buzz did here was very important for understanding how not only you can use this mathematical theory to understand predator-prey interactions, but in the real world, as the context of these predator-prey interactions changes, that you can get very complicated dynamics where a system can exist in alternate states, and that the possibility of shifting between these alternate states can change over time. And it was from this, I'm sort of muddying up the chronological order of it, but it's roughly from this kind of work that Buzz developed the idea of resilience, of science saying, well, this seems to be a more general property of systems. This was a 1973 paper, had the idea that you can kind of think about ecological resilience. And this is here just sort of saying you can think about a system that conventionally people have thought about a system's in some state, and if you whack it, it will come back. And how quickly it comes back, that's sort of a type of its resilience in an engineering sense. But Buzz sort of realized that systems can exist in multiple states. And then maybe a better way of thinking about resilience is how much whacking or shocks can a system take before it shifts to a different state totally. So in this case, you could think about the non-epidemic and the epidemic populations of spruce budworm that he was thinking about. And now, so that was in 1973. I think now, 35 years later, there's substantial evidence that this kind of ecological resilience is an important way of thinking about ecosystems. There's a whole bunch of evidence for this in populations like the spruce budworm, but also in many other species and in community organization. And now there's quite a lot of evidence, as Johan briefly mentioned, from lakes, coral reef, rangelands, savannas, steppe tundras, a whole bunch of systems. And I think an important point here is as well that Buzz's first paper on this was done 35 years ago. And it's really only in maybe the last 5-6 years that this idea has really reached large acceptance in ecology. After this idea was first published, there was actually a lot of reaction in the ecological community saying that, well, there's not enough evidence to really show this is true. And one of the reasons people had for not liking this idea, they said, well, Holling has only been able to show this in human-affected ecosystems. Ecological theory should really only concern itself with systems that don't have any people in them. And so, therefore, this kind of theory is only of marginal value. And of course, nowadays, I think most ecologists say, well, there's not really any systems without any people in them. And that's partly why this kind of idea has become more important. But secondly, it took also that long in some ways to get enough evidence to really strongly answer these critics and show that actually systems can stably persist in these different states. So one of the things that comes from that, too, is also that Buzz's sort of persistence in trying to look for evidence of these types of ideas. And from this, he abstracted, or I think talking with other people, that a lot of management was done basically based on different myths of how nature works. So this isn't meaning a kind of myth as a falsehood, but basically almost sort of a pre-analytical vision or a basic conceptual model about how the universe functions. And a typical sort of environmentalist one is that the world is very vulnerable and brittle. This could also be, say, the George Bush model of the world, that you have to really regulate things and protect yourself against people to keep things from falling apart, that a small disturbance will knock you apart, versus a sort of a very optimistic one, that a small disturbance won't cause much change, and you can just come back quite naturally, that nature is very robust. A third one is that, well, there's no real stability in nature. It's just kind of a nihilistic view of the world, that it's just sort of one thing after another, that things just happen. Or that fourth, that things can shift between alternate regimes. So each of these views of the world has different consequences for management. And this is something that Buzz kind of came up with from talking with managers and trying to simplify ecological theory, and from his work with the budworm. But also kind of realized that each of these is conveying a different view of the world, but they're all both true and all both wrong, because at any moment, all four of these different things are going on in different places, and any place will change between these different things over time. And this sort of led to the idea, well, how can we think about management? And thinking about management is sort of managing a world in which these sort of tipping points occur is really different than managing a world in which they don't. One that most management assumes that there's sort of smooth change, that sort of things go one way and that's it. But if you have tipping points, you need different types of policies. You need to try and identify, well, where are these tipping points? How can we manage them? What kind of policies can we do to recover? And then secondly, that tipping points often mean that you're going to have surprise, and they may be difficult to reverse, rather than something where you have gradual change, which you can easily reverse. And just to kind of think about this, to sort of relate to what Johan said, you can think about this in the world of climate change. If you're thinking about some ecosystem, you can imagine that climate change could be happening gradually, and your ecosystem could be responding either gradually or abruptly. Or you could have climate change happen abruptly, and your ecosystem respond gradually or abruptly. So up here, I have two columns, one of which is with gradual change and one was abrupt. And one of them is with the ecological response. The first row is with gradual response to climate change, and the second one is some more abrupt or resilience-oriented change. And what you can kind of see here is that you can get either type of response depending from either type of system. If you have a nonlinear ecological system with gradual change, you can get abrupt response. And if you have a linear ecological system with a driver of change, you can get abrupt response. So this is just pointing out that even though you might in some parts of the world have gradual change, often combining that with nonlinearity in another spot, you can still end up with abrupt change, suggesting that abrupt change is something that people really should be paying much more attention to managing. And it was kind of with these ideas in mind, I was going to skip this, that Buzz kind of recognized that ecosystems can be thought of as more evolving systems, where you can go through periods where you can be very much in a robust state to something where you're in much more of a random state to something where you have a very brittle state. And this led to him to think about, based on his experience working in New Brunswick on the spruce budworm, that you often see this sort of pathological ecosystem management, that what works in one time sets up a system which functions in a very different way, where the same approaches don't succeed anymore, that often sort of success leads to failure. So in New Brunswick, what happened is there's a very successful logging process that started to get increasing spruce budworm outbreaks. People started to apply more and more pesticide to control the spruce budworm, which in fact maintained lots of habitat for the spruce budworm and allowed the population to continue to grow. While at the same time, the forest industry became more and more dependent upon the reliability of forest products coming out of the forest industry. So they got into a situation where they had to have more and more spraying to keep more and more timber coming for a more and more dependent industry. And Buzz sort of, after reviewing many, many different cases, sort of realized that this was a general pattern of ecological management, that there was this pathology, which is pathological because it was people would get themselves into a trap where success lead to failure. That management focused on controlling an ecosystem often simplified and made more brittle the ecosystem, making it more vulnerable to shocks and disturbances. At the same time, while social dependence upon the reliability of that ecosystem became more and more dependent as people built up more and more industry that depended upon the reliable provision of ecosystem services. So in the case, say, of New Brunswick, if you had a few timber plants operating and you had a forest outbreak, it wouldn't be a really big problem because you could get timber from somewhere else, but in the forest. But if you have a huge timber industry, you need to have this very reliable supply of things. And so this kind of combination of increasing vulnerability with decreasing resilience leads to sort of a trap where people have to intervene more and more until eventually things fall apart. And so this kind of insight led to, I would sort of say, into this sort of conceptual model of the adaptive cycle, which tries to capture this. And I think it's important that this was originally coming from ecological dynamics, but ecological dynamics of managed systems. And people have already talked about this, so I'm not going to go into in detail. But in ecology, why this, I think, was valuable, in that it pointed out two things. And this is also sort of a shift, as Johan said, from Buzz's original thinking, was that in this front loop dynamic, there's this process of organization, competition, efficiency, consolidation. And in ecological terms, or thinking about resilience, this represents the ability of systems to cope with shock or avoid reorganization. So this was an important contribution of Buzz to science. But the second one was probably even more important to ecology after this first one, was recognizing this reorganization phase, which people had largely neglected in ecology. And recognizing here that this part of resilience in a system depends on the ability to recover after a disturbance and focus on these aspects of resilience in systems. And so this sort of suggests that the panarchical idea, which came up, was this idea of that thinking about sort of these cycles of destruction and renewal sort of explains what we need for sustainability and why sustainable development in some ways, while being paradoxical, in fact is not a paradox. That sustainability requires both change and persistence. And these kind of cycles going on at different scales are a way of providing this. Of that having small scales of destruction can provide the novelty that can give resilience back to these big scales, while large-scale dynamics provide the persistence that's required to maintain these small cycles. So you can have small things fail while having the big provide the context for which to occur. And as I think Buzz was saying in his talk, he's worried now that these big-scale systems are getting aligned with the small scale, leading to global vulnerability. And I'll just sort of quickly go through this, but in ecological theory, there's been a lot of new thinking that Buzz has really contributed to thinking about resilience, both in these abilities to cope and ability to recover. And some of this is done by people here, but sort of there's aspects of biodiversity that give you ability to cope are things like having functional diversity, or the ability of different species to do the same things that can fluctuate together. That response diversity, which is the ability of different species to respond differentially to shocks. So if there's an increase in acidity and different species fix nitrogen, if some species can't cope with the rise in acidities and others can, the function can keep going. And then finally, some work I did with Buzz is looking at cross-scale diversity of functions, that you have the same thing going on at different scales. So you have both big and small animals dispersing seeds or pollinating plants. And this provides critical diversity to different scales of change in an ecosystem. And interestingly, just a paper that recently assessed these types of ability to cope or give resilience to a system found there was actually evidence for the last two, but not for the first, which is kind of interesting because in ecology, the two main ideas that Buzz contributed, I think, are the second, even though the first one's based on his original work on predation. So there's a lot of new work coming up to see what maintains these functions in ecosystems. And then something that a lot of people at Stockholm have contributed to is the idea of, well, what helps ability to recover? So people have identified that after disturbance, there's sort of legacies of pattern, of structure, of biota, like seeds in a place, help an ecosystem come back. But these also depend really critically on the panarchical context of what are the support areas that help maintain, enable the recovery of a system through either mobile links that bring in energy and resources, or physical links like rivers or the movement of nutrients and energy through rainfall that help an area to recover. So, and this kind of work says that, things that people are doing that simplify ecosystems, that reduce the amount of functional diversity, that reduce the support areas of areas that are being disturbed, are all ways that we lose resilience. But you can build resilience by maintaining functions, managing diversity, nurturing sources of renewal, and slowing release. So by these ideas of the adaptive cycle and panarchy, Buzz's work has sort of posed new questions to ecology that many people in this room, but also Buzz Holling, have helped contribute to answer. And just to sort of wrap up, just to remind these sort of three ideas and the continued importance of them, I thought there was several things that, as sort of a scientist, you can draw from Buzz's work, and that the themes, which I've touched on a little bit, I think, what he's done to have such a successful career in ecology is that he looked for interesting problems, and then when working on these problems, he's tried to look for general patterns and encapsulate those patterns in either simple conceptual or simple mathematical models. So say the predation is a mathematical model, while the adaptive cycle is more a conceptual one. That he's worked very much to connect theory and practice, both working on theory and the practice of ecological management, and that kind of back and forth has really enriched his intellectual work. That he's continually formed interdisciplinary teams, both with different types of ecologists and with social scientists, and really worked to connect ecology to the world. So I think all these things have really resulted in a super productive career in ecology and made a whole bunch of contributions that have gone well outside ecology, which I believe people are going to talk about in the rest of the day. But with that, I'll finish up. Thanks very much.
I'll take a bit.